welcome back to Pastor's Corner, a teaching series. If you're joining us, we're going through the book of James. So last week we looked at an introduction to the book of James and also James chapter 1 verses 1 through 4. This week we're going to look through a few more passages. I'm deciding to break it up into smaller segments. You can binge watch it as if you're watching a Netflix special, or you can just simply go at your own pace. So today we're going to look at James chapter 1. Verses 5 through 8. James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. Here's what it says. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Well, if you are joining us, last week we were looking at James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and that passage is talking about testings and trials and why we go through them. So James addresses the why question. The why question of why we go through trials and testing is the very fact that trials and testing will lead us to spiritual maturity, to be more like Jesus. So that's the why question. Today, if you look at verses 5 through 8, we're going to start to address the how. How can you go through trials? And so the first thing that James is going to challenge us with is that if we lack wisdom, we should ask God. So the first thing that we're going to need when we go through a trial is we're going to need wisdom. Well, what is wisdom? Wisdom is there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. We live in the information age today, where you can get information at the tip of your fingers. You can go online anywhere and you can gather and store all kinds of information. Knowledge then is that we know information, we know stuff. We have a lot of knowledge about a lot of different things out there. But wisdom is the idea of us applying the knowledge that we know and applying it correctly. See, we all know things. We all know that 5 minus 3 equals 2, and that's good knowledge. But how does that play out in wisdom if we don't apply it? Well, if we go to the coffee shop and you give a $5 bill for your $3 coffee, and all they give you back is $1, you're not applying wisdom, because you should know that 5 minus 3 equals 2, you should be getting $2 back, right? So that's wisdom, is that we would apply the correct information and knowledge to our lives. Well, the Bible also talks about wisdom. The idea here is that we get wisdom when we ask God. Wisdom comes from God. And so James is saying, if wisdom comes from God, we need to know who God is. And so by knowing who God is, then we apply what we know about God to our everyday lives. This is the wisdom that James is talking about, to apply what we know about God to our everyday lives. And in this specific context, to apply what we know about God to our trials. In Proverbs 9:10, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." That's the starting point. God. Wisdom comes from God. The fear of the Lord is to have this healthy perspective of awe and wonder for who God is, and then to apply that to our daily lives. So God promises wisdom in our trials, it says here. So God is not just a genie that you can ask, but in fact, if you ask this thing, he does indeed give it to you, because we're going to need wisdom for our trials. So we're going to need wisdom for trials, because we need to know what to say and not to say, what to do and what not to do. And again, trials are to bring us to spiritual maturity so that we would be more like Jesus. And so God gives to us, it says, God gives to us generously when we ask for wisdom. And I like that concept. There's a Greek word there called haplos there. And that idea is that God gives without holding back. The idea is that he gives without holding back. He is so generous when we ask for wisdom. He's going to give us wisdom without holding anything back. That means it's going to overflow you. And so when you're in the middle of a trial, you're going to need that wisdom, and God gives it generously. The second thing we know is that when God gives it, he gives it without reproach, it says. He gives it without reproach, which means, he gives it without finding fault in you. You know how many times as a parent, I know I've done this a lot of times, maybe you've done this, you get frustrated with your kids and you say, why don't you know this? Why don't you know how to do this? Or why don't you understand this? And when we ask for wisdom from God, God doesn't say that to us. He doesn't say, why don't you understand this? He just says he gives it without finding fault in you. if you continue on in verses 6 through 8, and these are some challenging verses here, it talks about doubting. And I often wonder at first glance what this means. And it says, when you ask, don't doubt. And so sometimes I wonder if God doesn't answer our prayers when we ask Him, when we ask for things from Him, does it mean I didn't have enough faith? Was I doubting too much? What does that mean? Can I manipulate God in any way? And that's not what this is talking about. There's a context here, remember, and we're talking about wisdom in trials. And so we often ask why, and at times when trials happen, we end up starting to doubt things. And I think James is addressing that. We doubt God's goodness, we doubt God's presence, we doubt God, and eventually we end up doubting ourselves. And so I think James is trying to challenge us to hold on to the truth of who God is. Don't doubt that in the midst of our trials. So if we ask for wisdom, hold on to the truth that God gives wisdom generously. He gives it without finding fault. Hold on to godly wisdom, and to realize that even though we're in the midst of a trial or a challenge, it doesn't change who God is. It doesn't change who God is. And that's a truth that we need to hold on to. And so James illustrates that by saying, well, we're like the waves of the sea that go back and forth and back and forth. It's because when we doubt who God is. And when we doubt ourselves as well. And so we know that, again, trials are supposed to bring us to spiritual maturity. But then we start to doubt that. And we're not supposed to doubt that. We're supposed to hold on to the fact that we believe and trust that God is going to bring us through this to spiritual maturity. We know trials are not because God hates us, but He loves us. But then we start to doubt that. We know that trials are not a punishment, but then we start to doubt that as well. And so the challenge is, don't doubt God's character or His purposes in trials. Ultimately, God doesn't change. And what He's doing through trials is to bring us to spiritual maturity, to be more like Him. So if you're going through a trial, James challenges us, ask for wisdom, because we're going to need it. And when we ask, don't doubt about who God is, that He gives it generously, that He gives it without finding fault, that He gives it to us without reservation. And we're going to need it. We're going to need it to go through these trials so that we understand again, and we're constantly reminded that these trials will bring us to spiritual maturity. So what to do with that? My hope is that maybe you would take some time this week to thank God for who He is and for what He has done. Whether you're in good times or in bad times, God doesn't change because of our circumstances. And that's a great truth to hold on to. If you're going through a trial or a testing or a challenging time, I want to encourage you, ask for wisdom. Ask for wisdom. God gives it generously. He gives it without finding fault. And we're going to need it. We're going to need it to understand why we're going through this. We're going to need it to discern and know and hold on to the fact that this trial will lead us into spiritual maturity. If you know someone going through a trial, pray for wisdom for them. Pray for wisdom for yourself so that you know what to say and not to say, or what to do and what not to do. And if you're going to go through a trial in the future, maybe you haven't gone through one, you're going to go through one in the future, I want to encourage you, again, ask for wisdom. Just keep that in the back of your head so that you would be able to discern what God is doing. And if nothing else, try this. Ask daily for wisdom from God. Ask for it daily. This way we can make wise choices throughout our lives. We can always discern between right and wrong. So that's it for this segment here, verses 5 through 8 of chapter 1 of James. Hope you join us again for the next video as we continue going through on this journey of the book of James.